That day, when the wheelchair quietly rolled into the company lobby, no one knew that the disabled man sitting on it was actually their most powerful CEO. Why would the head of the company have to sit here, in the guise of a weak man? And would what he was about to witness change the company forever? Before diving into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. David was a young, talented, and determined Black CEO who built his company from scratch. However, he always felt a growing distance between himself and his employees. To better understand the work environment and how people truly treated each other, David decided to conduct a bold experiment, pretending to be paralyzed and moving around in a wheelchair for a week. But little did he know, during this week of pretending to be disabled, David would quietly uncover a shocking truth. When David appeared in the office as a disabled man, he hoped to receive empathy and support from his employees. However, what he got were indifferent glances, whispers behind his back filled with disdain, and even outright avoidance. Some saw him as a burden, while others completely ignored his presence. What hurt David the most was the reaction from Mark, his closest assistant. Mark had been David's right-hand man, entrusted with important tasks throughout the years they built the team together. David always saw Mark as a companion, someone who understood the effort and passion he poured into the company. No one knew that during the week of pretending to be disabled, David silently exposed a shocking secret. The person he trusted the most, Mark, not only looked down on the weak but also secretly manipulated the company and seized power from David's hands. In the tense atmosphere of the meeting room, where all eyes were fixed forward, the door suddenly opened. The wheelchair quietly rolled in, carrying David as he slowly advanced with a detailed plan he had poured his heart and countless sleepless nights into. But as soon as David began to speak, Mark coldly interrupted him with a sneer. "Someone like you wants to contribute ideas? Don't waste our time," Mark said mockingly, without hiding his contempt. The room fell silent, with only hushed whispers from a few employees who dared not speak up. Mark stood there, arms crossed, eyes sweeping over David as if he were a worthless being. Those words were not just an insult but a dagger that pierced David's pride, shattering the trust he once placed in his assistant. David clenched the armrest of the wheelchair, struggling to suppress the rising anger and disappointment. He didn't respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he knew that any word spoken now would be twisted into a joke by Mark. In that moment, David felt the loneliness amidst the crowd, avoiding eyes, fake busy gestures, and not a single person standing up for him. No one dared confront Mark, who had now crowned himself as the leader of all. After the meeting, David quietly rolled his wheelchair out of the room. No one looked at him, no one cared. In the very company he built, he had become an outcast. That afternoon, David quietly entered the restroom and couldn't hold back his tears. He had never felt so lonely and hurt. But he reminded himself that this wasn't the end. Mark could look down on him, but David wouldn't let that contempt define his worth. And as for Mark, the betrayer's true face was about to be revealed. After that meeting, Mark didn't stop at humiliating David in front of everyone. He realized this was the golden opportunity to solidify his power and completely eliminate David's influence within the company. Mark began to act strategically, taking advantage of David's current weakness to position himself as the only leader the employees could rely on. First, Mark held a private meeting with the mid-level managers, those who had once been loyal to David but were now wavering in the face of the new situation. Sitting at the head of the table, his tone calm yet authoritative, Mark said, "David was once a good leader, but as you can see, he is no longer fit to run the company. We need a new direction, someone who can truly lead us forward." He subtly planted seeds of doubt, emphasizing that David was now a burden and that the company would collapse without immediate change. Some nodded in agreement, while others remained silent, too afraid to object. Next, Mark began manipulating the projects David had once overseen. He quietly altered reports, stole credit for David's previous achievements, and presented them as his own to the board of directors. He even spread rumors that David had lost his clarity of mind after the accident, claiming that his recent ideas were nothing more than the delusions of a man who couldn't accept reality. Slowly, David's image in the eyes of the employees was distorted, from a respected leader to a pathetic, outdated figure. The employees, who had already avoided David after the meeting incident, became even colder toward him. Whenever David appeared in the office, they found excuses to slip away. Some of his former close subordinates only nodded briefly when he greeted them, their eyes avoiding his as if speaking to him was a burden. Once, when David asked a young employee to deliver documents to his office, she claimed to be too busy and passed the task to someone else, whispering to a colleague, "Why doesn't he just retire? What's the point of holding on?" Those words, though spoken softly, still reached David's ears, making him feel utterly isolated in the very company he once considered home. Mark didn't miss the chance to push David further into a corner. He proposed to the board of directors that David should be given rest for health reasons, along with a restructuring plan that would place Mark in the highest executive position. To ensure success, Mark began bribing or threatening those who might oppose him. Some senior employees were tempted with promises of promotions, while others were warned that they'd lose their jobs if they didn't side with Mark. The atmosphere within the company grew increasingly tense. People began choosing sides, and most of them sided with Mark, the one who now held real power. Meanwhile, David wasn't blind to what was happening. Sitting alone in the small office he had been pushed into after the fateful meeting, he quietly observed everything through accidentally forwarded emails and meetings he was no longer invited to. He knew Mark was plotting to take over the company and realized he had lost the support of most employees. But instead of collapsing, David understood that to defeat Mark, he couldn't rely on pride or sympathy. He needed a strategy sharper than Mark's. One late afternoon, when the office was nearly empty, David sat in front of his computer, scrolling through old emails, documents, and even secret recordings he had kept over the years, evidence of his contributions and the times Mark had stolen his ideas. He discovered a hastily deleted email in which Mark unintentionally revealed his plan to sell the company to a rival corporation once he seized control. "You think you're so clever, Mark?" David muttered, his voice trembling with anger and determination. David quietly reached out to major shareholders who had once supported him during the company's early days. He shared all the evidence of Mark's abuse of power and manipulation. At the same time, he hired an IT team to investigate the shady financial transactions Mark had made to acquire company shares. While David worked in silence, Mark remained oblivious that every step he took was being tracked. When Mark held a secret meeting with a group of employees to officially overthrow David, the entire conversation was secretly recorded by David. The next day, during an emergency meeting, David unexpectedly showed up with all the evidence in hand. Mark arrogantly walked into the large meeting room, ready to announce his victory. However, he froze when he saw David already sitting at the table, a thick stack of documents in front of him. The room fell silent, heavy with tension. David raised his head, his eyes cold and piercing. "You want to steal my company? Fine. But first, explain this to the board of directors." He pressed play on the recording, and Mark's voice echoed clearly, revealing every dirty scheme he had plotted. The room erupted in chaos. Employees panicked, whispering in disbelief, while Mark turned pale and stammered, unable to defend himself. Mark's voice in the recording, smooth, smug, and revealing his plan to sell the company to a rival corporation, sent all eyes turning toward him. The board members, who had once been manipulated by Mark, turned pale, gripping the meeting minutes as if they were about to tear them apart. The employees whispered in panic, some sneaking glances at David with astonishment and shame. Mark stood there, sweat trickling down his forehead, his eyes filled with fear, like a beast cornered with no way out. But David wasn't about to give him a chance to retaliate. David slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a declaration of war. "Mark, you were wrong. I spent my entire life building this company, and I won't let a traitor like you destroy it." He raised a small black USB drive, drawing everyone's gaze. "This holds everything, every email, every transaction, every piece of evidence proving you've stolen my ideas and plotted to sell the company. Board members, you want the truth? I have enough to take Mark to court, and those who supported him as well." The room erupted. A board member shouted, "Is this real?" Another one snatched the file from David's hand, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. Mark tried to roar back, "Lies. He's fabricating this to save his own position." But his voice cracked, stripped of authority. David smirked coldly, "Lies? Then explain this, Mark. Why did your personal account receive millions from our competitor right after you proposed restructuring the company?" A large screen behind David lit up, showing the transaction history, undeniable evidence. The room exploded with anger. Employees who once mocked David now turned on Mark, hurling accusations and disgust. The board wasted no time. As the screen faded to black, leaving a heavy silence, the chairman of the board, an elderly man with a stern face, slammed his hand on the table. "Mark, you're fired immediately. We will press charges against you for fraud, abuse of power, and attempting to sabotage this company. Prepare to face court. You won't escape this." Mark stood there, his legs trembling as if they could collapse at any moment, his face pale with fear and humiliation. He slumped into a chair, defeated. Yet, in his eyes, a dark flame of hatred still burned. He knew he had lost this battle, but he wasn't the type to surrender easily. As security guards entered to drag him out, Mark glared at David with venomous eyes and muttered, "You'll regret humiliating me, David." The guards escorted him out of the meeting room amidst boos and scornful gazes from the very employees who once flattered him. But the moment that truly left the entire room in stunned silence happened next. David, the man everyone believed was bound to a wheelchair forever, slowly rose to his feet. His hands left the armrest, his legs firmly touching the ground, and he walked, slowly but with undeniable strength. Gasps filled the room. How is this possible? He wasn't paralyzed? David raised his head, his voice calm yet echoing with power. "I was never paralyzed. The wheelchair was a test, not for me, but for all of you." The room froze in disbelief. "My dear colleagues," David continued, his tone heavy with emotion. "I pretended to be disabled for the past week, not to assess your work performance, but to understand the true nature of the environment we've built together. I wanted to see what I would receive when I was no longer the powerful CEO you all once respected. And sadly, I witnessed indifference, ridicule, and even betrayal from the person I trusted the most." The room remained dead silent. David stepped forward, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had mocked him, those who avoided him, and those who stayed silent in the face of Mark's betrayal. "I wanted to see who would truly stand by me when I was at my weakest," David's voice trembled with emotion. "And I saw it. I saw Mark stepping on me to climb higher. I saw you turning your backs, pretending not to hear when I needed help. But I also saw those who didn't abandon me, even when they risked being isolated. And today, I take back this company, not with fists, but with truth and justice." A hesitant round of applause erupted from the corner of the room, gradually spreading like a wave. Employees who once looked down on David now stood up, their eyes filled with newfound respect and remorse. Someone shouted, "We're sorry, David. We won't let this happen again." David smiled, not with the triumph of victory, but with the relief of reclaiming what he had lost: trust. As for Mark, he wasn't just fired. The next day, the police stormed his house, handcuffing him in front of his family and neighbors. The company filed a lawsuit, accusing him of embezzling millions, with the video recordings and emails serving as undeniable evidence. Mark faced decades in prison. But that wasn't the worst part. With the help of Ethan, a skilled hacker who once left the company in frustration due to Mark's tyranny, David exposed everything to the public. The video revealing Mark's crimes and his betrayal went viral, turning Mark into a symbol of greed and failure, a stain on society that could never be erased. Mark sat in his prison cell, forgotten by the world, except for the mocking laughter of those who once called him an ally. When everything settled, David stood alone on the rooftop of the company building, overlooking the dazzling city lights. He thought about the days he spent in the wheelchair, the pain of seeing those he trusted turn away, and the strength he found within himself to endure it all. He realized that true victory didn't come from defeating Mark, but from restoring the positive environment he had worked so hard to build, a place where loyalty and respect outweighed personal ambition. And from that moment on, David understood one thing. Sometimes, true strength lies not in conquering others, but in standing tall through the storm and protecting the values you've built with your own blood and sweat.